Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I am Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's panelists for a discussion about a history of violence targeting Mexican descent people in the Texas borderlands. Tonight, we are joined by three scholars who are part of an important collective called Refusing to Forget, which is the recipient of the Herbert Weiss Award from the American Historical Association for distinguished contributions to public history in the last decade. Just before I introduce our panelists, I do want to quickly thank our funders for whom we could not do events like this, including the City of San Antonio, Bexar County, the University of Texas at Austin, and all of our individual supporters. If you'd like to learn more about supporting MACRI, I invite you to visit somosmacri.org. Okay, we have some great panelists with us tonight. First up, we have Dr. John Moran Gonzalez. He is the J. Frank Dobie Regents Professor of American and English Literature at the University of Texas at Austin. He has published numerous articles about American literature, as well as two books, Border Renaissance, the Texas Centennial and the Emergence of Mexican-American Literature, and The Troubled Union, Expansionist Imperatives in Post-Reconstruction American Novels. And of course, he's one of the editors of a brand new book that just is coming out this month, which we'll hear more about, which is the name of tonight's event, Reverberations of Racial Violence. Next up, we have the other editor of the book, Dr. Sonia Hernandez, who is an associate professor at Texas A&M University at College Station. And she specializes in the intersections of gender and labor in the US-Mexican borderlands, Chicana, Chicano history, and modern Mexico. She has a new book out, in addition to the Reverberations of Racial Violence, called For a Just and Better World, Engendering Anarchism in the Mexican Borderlands, 1900 to 1938, which I hope she'll tell us a little bit more about tonight. And then we have Dr. Monica Munoz Martinez, award-winning author, teacher, and public historian. Her first book, The Injustice Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, has received numerous awards. She is the primary investigator for Mapping Violence, Racial Terror in Texas, 1900 and 1930, a digital project that recovers histories of racial violence in Texas, which I also hope we'll learn more about tonight. And of course, most recently, she was named a MacArthur Fellow. Very exciting stuff. Thank you so much for being here with us. Okay, what I would like to do is have the three of you share a bit about just an overview of Refusing to Forget for our audience members who maybe haven't heard of it before. Where did Refusing to Forget come from? How did you get involved in launching this? And what have you done so far? I know you keep winning awards, so you're obviously doing something.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm going to go ahead and start off for the group, and I'll share some slides. But briefly, I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation and congratulations to MACRI and for all of the work that you've done so far. It's exciting to be in conversation and to think about building the future public history and humanities projects here in Texas together. So I'm thrilled also to be in conversation with John and with Sonia, and seeing them and their faces always just brings me joy to be in conversation. My own work in histories of racist violence in South Texas has been inspired not just by the history of the long calls for social justice and people trying to shine a light on the histories of anti-Mexican violence, but also the work of communities to preserve those memories. And so Refusing to Forget is an educational nonprofit that we built in collaboration in 2014 to help commemorate the centennial anniversary of the peak of anti-Mexican violence in 1915. It was a period of racist terror that was state-sanctioned, ethnic Mexicans, whether they had American citizenship or whether they were Mexican nationals, were targeted with violence by vigilantes, by local law enforcement, by U.S. soldiers, and by Texas Rangers. And so my co-founders in Refusing to Forget, we were a group of scholars who had published articles and books on this long history of anti-Mexican violence, but realized that the public audiences didn't have access to those more accurate, more truthful accounts of the past. And we also realized that there had been community members, some who were descendants of victims of racist violence, who had been calling for a public acknowledgement. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly so that people can get just a quick overview of some of our public projects. So Refusing to Forget, we have a website that people can visit, www.refusingtoforget.org, where you can find out more information about the project and actually access a whole set of resources of readings and digital content that you can access. So we came together again in 2014 to try to commemorate, recognizing that in 2015, that it would have been 100 years since this peak of anti-Mexican violence, that we wanted people to commemorate the lives of those that were lost, but also to learn about the civil rights icons, people who had been calling for justice, people who had been trying to change policing cultures and trying to end lynching cultures. That was such an important part of Texas history that that unfortunately people haven't had access to learning those histories in classrooms or by visiting museums. And so we wanted to work to give public audiences access to that history. We also realized that this history was important and urgent to learn from, because we recognized that patterns of anti-Mexican sentiment and violence were continuing into 100 years later. And so we recognized that it was also important not just to recover a history that had been disavowed or ignored or were celebrated, but also to learn from those lessons of history so that we could address social injustices that were continuing today. We collaborated. This is a photograph of Ben Johnson's on the left. That's me and John and Sonia and Trinidad Gonzalez, who worked with us to co-found Refusing to Forget. We collaborated with different groups for our project. This is a photograph of us outside of the Bullock Texas State History Museum, the flagship state history museum in Texas, in 2016, when we unveiled an exhibit called Life and Death on the Border. I'll talk a little bit more about that. This is a photograph also on the far left is Professor Dr. Chris Carmona, who has recently joined Refusing to Forget as a member, helping us with public projects. And to his right is his brother, Mr. Juan Carmona, who is a high school teacher in Donna, Texas, who has also been a collaborator for our efforts in getting access, providing opportunities for students in high school to learn from this history of anti-Mexican violence. So this is a quick photo on the left of the Life and Death on the Border exhibit that was unveiled at the Bullock Museum in 2016. It was a temporary exhibit that was only up for about 10 weeks, but over 40,000 people came to see that exhibit. It was the first time a cultural institution in the state of Texas was acknowledging this period of state-sanctioned violence in the early 20th century, not just acknowledging that this violence took place, that estimated, potentially thousands of ethnic Mexicans were murdered or lynched or killed during this period, but specifically also acknowledge that the state's involvement and the involvement of, as I said, Texas Rangers in committing some of these acts of brutality, but also governors calling for the violence. And so we created an exhibit in collaboration with the Bullock, really lending our knowledge as content experts, but also helping to introduce the Bullock to community members who had archives to help bring the exhibit to life. On the photograph on the right is one of my favorite photographs, because it shows, the impact of having an exhibit at the Bullock, that school children in Texas had access to this history. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what we hope to do with the exhibit later. We also have collaborated with the Texas Historical Commission to unveil historical markers. We have a fourth that isn't pictured here, but the first on the left that we unveiled was to commemorate the Matanza of 1915 and the peak of anti-Mexican violence. And this is a marker that is placed in Cameron County. In the center is a marker that is in Hidalgo County, and it is to commemorate the double murder of Jesus Bazan and Antonio Longoria, who were murdered by a posse, including a Texas Ranger, in September 1915. And on the right is a historical marker for Jovita Idad, who again was threatened and did face intimidation and violence herself, but she was also a suffragist, an educator, a journalist, and who was somebody who helped create a record of the violence that we have studied to preserve accounts of what took place. And we collaborated with students at Brown University to create a curriculum, a lesson plan on the life of and contributions of Jovita Idad. And so this is a lesson plan that is available for free for educators to access on our website. We also have collaborated with journalists. We didn't realize when we started working on this project that there would be opportunities to share history through collaborating with journalists, sitting for interviews, in some cases, helping journalists to meet descendants, to tell their stories. And this is an example of an interview with Melba Cudi, who is a descendant of Jesus Bazan and Antonio Longoria, who was interviewed by Rosa Flores. And so people can visit that interview, which is quite moving for us that it exists because Melba Cudi passed away not too long ago. And as a descendant of violence who shared her family history with us, we miss her presence. This is a photograph of Benita Alvarado in the center with her husband, Buddy Alvarado, and their children. And this is a photograph that was taken at the Bullock Museum in 2016. And behind them is a photograph of Juan Bonilla Flores and Narciso Flores, who were survivors of the Bormir massacre in 1918. And this is an important photograph, not only to acknowledge the work of Benita Alvarado and her husband, but also to acknowledge that the Bullock Museum exhibit that we helped, that we contributed to, could not have provided audiences with access to the faces of some of the victims and the survivors if it wasn't for people like Benita Alvarado, who lent family photographs and documents to be on display at the Bullock. So this is a close-up of that family portrait. This is a portrait of Antonia Longoria and Antonio Longoria when they were young and had just been married. And so this is an example of the kinds of photographs that were on display at the Bullock, again, thanks to the generosity of people like Norma Longoria Rodriguez and Melba Cudi, who had preserved their family archives. And thanks to that effort, that family effort of preserving family archives, we were able to see the face of Antonio Longoria and tell his story. This is a photograph of Epigmenia Bazan and her granddaughters on their porch in their home. This was another photograph that was on display, and it's one of my favorite photographs. I love baby with the sass, on the porch. And this is a photograph. Norma Longoria Rodriguez is in the center, and her cousin Richard Martinez is sitting next to her, and there's Melba Cudi and her daughter Christine Molise, who all participated in the unveiling ceremonies of the Bazan and Longoria historical marker, but a whole set of public history events that we coordinated for each of the historical marker unveilings. So this is a photograph of them. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the different audiences that we have considered in designing these public projects are multiple. So there, of course, we are thinking about public school educators and how they can use resources that we create in the classroom. Field trips, for example, to historical markers. We also think about general audiences, people who are not familiar with this history, but who want to learn and are eager to learn. But we've also been thinking and working and collaborating with descendants like Norma Longoria Rodriguez and her family to commemorate these histories, and recognizing that public history has a role to play in bringing about some healing, not closure, but some healing for families who have been calling for justice, as I said earlier, for generations. And so acknowledging the ongoing need to acknowledge, to commemorate these histories, to speak about them truthfully, and to collaborate with state institutions to acknowledge these histories has an important role in the work that we do, and that has been inspired by our conversations with descendants. This is a photograph of Erlinda Valencia, who lives in El Paso, Texas, and she's created incredible public projects to commemorate the Bodnik massacre in 1918. And this is her speaking at an event in anticipation of calling for a historical marker for the Bodnik massacre. So I'm going to pass this over to Sonia to talk about another collaboration that we had with the Bullock Museum in 2019. But again, I'm going to come back to this photograph because one thing that we recognize in terms of potential for more work to be done and the great transformative possibilities of these histories is to reach new generations. So we acknowledge that there are generations of Texas who learned these histories from family members, informally at family barbecues. But we are hoping that with the kinds of work that we're doing, that we can give access to these histories to new generations of Texans. And so that we don't have to do the important work of teaching people histories where they had been learning Texas myths instead of difficult but important truths. And so we recognize that there's a lot of work in collaborating with public institutions, but also collaborating with educators, as I said, to reach a new generation. So I'm going to pass it over to Sonia, who's going to talk about reverberations of racial violence and some of the collaborations in 2019 with the Bullock Museum. So to do that, I'm going to stop sharing, but I hope that people can visit this website for the University of Texas Press to order a book. And so I'll stop sharing so Sonia can speak.
Thank you so much, Monica, for getting us started. As Monica pointed out, so we continued various collaborations, and one of those collaborations was with the Bullock State Museum and the now director, Margaret Cope. And we were absolutely thrilled to have received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, who believed in Refusing to Forget and believed in this project of recovering these dark moments in our state's history, but also to show the deep resiliency on the part of the community. And Reverberations of Racial Violence, this new anthology published by UT Austin Press just this summer, is a testament to that need, to that urgent need to continue the conversation. So in 2019, Refusing to Forget came together, and we organized this conference to reflect upon the centennial of the very first state-led investigation into Texas Ranger violence. Now, this was a response, a direct response to the indiscriminate manner in which the Rangers were acting vis-a-vis the Texas Mexican community. And not the first Mexican-American state legislator, but the lone Mexican-American state legislator, Jose Tomas Canales, better known as JT Canales, responded to the calls on the part of his constituents. He was, again, a public servant. He was a lawyer in his own right, trained out of Michigan. He came from an affluent landed family, but he never forgot about the broader community. And so in the spring of 1919, really as a direct response to the horrific, gruesome Porvenir massacre that had taken place roughly a year before, in early 1918, Canales took it upon himself to call for an investigation into Texas Ranger atrocities. And I mean, this resulted in a hearing that now we call the Canales hearings, or the Canales investigation, which produced some 1,600 pages of direct evidence from Texas Mexicans, both men and women, from the Anglo-American community, both men and women. And so there was just plenty of evidence there in the form of testimonials. Some of them very, very disturbing, where, entire family members witness the killing of their loved ones. And so it was really important for us in this conference at the Bullock, and as a follow-up in this anthology, to not only examine this history, reflect upon this history as a moment, really as one piece or part of the larger process of nation making and border making. I mean, this was really, a reflection of, the larger and more profound transformation that was taking place along the border that coincided with the Porfiriato, if we look at it from the Mexican perspective, or the progressive period, if we look at it from the US perspective. And so, even Canales himself, Canales was a progressive reformer. His intention was to reform the Ranger force. There were, he was not necessarily calling for the abolishment of the Ranger force. And so, and he could have easily done that. But even so, he was calling for serious reforms. There were so many folks who were strongly opposed to it. So much that during the hearings in that spring of 1919, Canales himself was sort of put on the stand. The attorney on behalf of the state actually questioned his U.S. patriotism and his loyalty to the country. In fact, Canales was a U.S. citizen. And so he was, this then became something, this became a case against Canales, questioning his so-called, quote, Mexican blood. And so, despite all of that, and despite the fact that Canales himself was actually harassed in Cameron County in Brownsville, Texas, he was actually harassed by a ranger actually in Brownsville and in Austin during the hearings, so much that he had to seek support from some of his colleagues. One of those folks who came to his support was Sam Johnson, the father of future Senator and future President Lyndon B. Johnson. So I point that out just to, make a larger point that if someone like Canales, received death threats and was treated this way, one can only imagine how just, ordinary residents of Mexican origin were treated. Mm-hmm. And so it's this dark chapter in our history, but also the voices like Canales and community resistance that we wanted to feature in this anthology. And so we brought together scholars from across the nation, looking at various forms of state-sanctioned and racial violence. We have presenters talking about the experience of African Americans in the Deep South, Asian Americans out in the West, lynching in a comparative context, not just these atrocities that happen along the border during 1910, 1920, but also in the greater Southwest and the greater U.S. Southwest. And so we are just so happy that this conversation, now has a longer shelf life in the various activities that we are engaged in with Refusing to Forget, but also in the form of this anthology. And I'll now pass it on to my colleague and fellow co-editor, John.
Well, thank you, Sonia. It was an incredible privilege to work with you on editing this volume and with the contributors in what they, all the incredible work that they've done in order to tell this story. And of course, with all the members of Refusing to Forget. So I'll just add to a little bit to what Sonia mentioned about the anthology. One has to place all of this in the context of the state of the extreme racial hierarchies of Texas at that time. You saw in the exhibit, it was called Juan Crow. And because the practices were quite similar, parallel as it were, with Jim Crow for African Americans, even if they were not legally enshrined in this quite the same way. Nonetheless, the context of this violence is precisely that there is basically impunity for law enforcement in their actions against ethnic Mexican people. And really, it was the reason why Gregorio Cortez, went on his famous run in 1901, that the law enforcement enjoyed such immunity that no white jury was going to ever convict a white man, much less a white law enforcement officer, of extra-legal violence against a person of Mexican descent. So it's in this context that J.T. Canales' insistence and successful insistence upon a legislative investigation is all the more remarkable, because it really represents one of the first times that Mexican descent people, Mexican Americans, have turned to the mechanisms of the state itself in order to seek some kind of justice, or not that, of course, there wasn't recourse to this before. It was just that they were always unsuccessful for the most part. And so, but getting the state to investigate, its state police force's own actions was a huge thing that later led the groundwork for the organization of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. So certainly, and also I think one of the other kind of responses to that is that prior to this moment, there wasn't really much need on the Anglo-Texan side for justifications for this sort of violence. But basically you get historians like Walter Prescott Webb, who then decide to devote much of their careers to an explicit defense of racialized violence on the part of the Rangers. That all of a sudden there has to be this justification for which Webb, turns to kind of a racial hierarchy of Texas in order to justify the violence there. So the implications this had for the state, for the production of knowledge in universities and in other areas, was just enormous. And so we wanted to kind of use contemporary scholarship to illuminate this in ways that I think had not quite been done. Of course, there had been some scholarship, but including many articles and books by Refusing to Forget members, but we wanted to bring it together around the Canales investigation as a kind of snapshot of both that moment in 1919, but also the way that contemporary scholars are discussing such issues.
Well, one of the things I think is so remarkable about the Refusing to Forget project is that, and historians know this, but the general public may not, and that's that there's this history that is known in families, this sort of like kitchen table history, and then there's this history that is officially recognized, the history that's in the textbooks, the history that gets taught officially, right, in schools and that sort of thing. And I feel that the Refusing to Forget project has been breaking through that, what is officially known, and bringing that to the public, because as John said, there are scholars who have written about this, and then certainly within family histories, people know about this, but making this get to the public eye seems like it's taken years. And it was really remarkable when that exhibit went to the Bullock, because as Monica mentioned, it was the first time that a state entity really acknowledged this, because for those who may not know, the Bullock is run by the state of Texas, right? It's officially sanctioned, gets their money from the state, has that name of a statesman on it. And so bringing that to the public when so many hundreds of families know this because they experienced it, but to never have it officially acknowledged. I mean, just the meaning of that is so heavy. And I just, on the one hand, I want to thank you for doing that work, because I think it's so important that the public know this. But I also know there's more to do. So no pressure. You're doing amazing work, all of you. Maybe Monica, maybe we can circle back to you and have you tell us about this project that you're working on, the mapping of violence, and that's another way of getting information out to the public. Can you tell us more?
Yes, well, unfortunately, there's a very deep history of racist violence in Texas, not only anti-Mexican violence, anti-Black violence, also anti-Native and Indigenous violence, and anti-Asian violence. And there were also white ethnic minorities that were targeted with violence by white supremacists like the Ku Klux Klan. And we don't have a record of all of the victims of violence. We don't have a record. The closest thing that we have are records of lynchings, people who died at the hands of brutal methods by mobs in Texas. But when we think about the history of anti-Mexican violence, that reminds us that so many people were murdered, denied due process, in some cases shot just on sight. By law enforcement or by Texas Rangers. And they, for too long, have not been considered victims of racist violence. And so the work that we've been doing for Refusing to Forget introduced me, and also in the research for my book, I just kept finding so many names of people that had been murdered or beaten and brutalized. Maybe they didn't die, but they were terrorized by law enforcement or by vigilantes. But their names were not included in lists. And so part of the work of mapping violence is to create a record of cases of racist violence from 1900 to 1930 that looks at victims of different racial and ethnic groups, and also victims of different kinds of violence. So from lynchings all the way to police shootings and murders, but also to things just like torture and abuse, with the motivation of creating climates of racial terror across the state. And so the project was also, though, inspired by the challenges of getting these historical markers approved, that it took several years of reapplying. And for the case of the Buenavida massacre, many years of reapplying. For the case of Jesus Bazan Antonio Longoria's double murder, 3 years of applications. And one of the applications for the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez was never approved. There is an acknowledgement of his lynching in 1910 in Rock Springs, Texas, in a historical marker down in Laredo that commemorates the El Primer Congreso Mexicanista, which was a civil rights binational conference. But so the project is working not only to create a record, to study the victims, their families, also to create a record of the aggressors. In some cases, it was the same law enforcement, the same Texas Rangers that were moving around the state, committing acts of terror and violence in South Texas and West Texas and in East Texas. But also, the newest part of the project is that me and students at Brown and now students at UT Austin that are helping me to collect this record and to create narratives about each of these cases, is that we're also learning the names of new people who called for justice, journalists, lawyers, neighbors, everyday people who were witnesses to acts of violence, who called for accountability, things like undertakers who despite being intimidated by law enforcement or by mobs, said, we are going to give this person a proper burial. And so we are building not only a record of racist violence, but also building what we're calling as a component of this is a social justice archive, so that we can make it available to the public online using different digital tools, mapping tools, using digital storytelling, but so that people have a different way to enter the history. They can learn the history also through those who were social justice advocates. And so, in terms of your institute, MACRI, there's such an inspiring history of Mexican-American civil rights, African-American civil rights, of a civil rights movement in Texas that unfortunately public audiences haven't had access to. And so as historians, I think we have a responsibility to recover these histories, document them, but also make them public.
Do you want to talk a little bit about obstacles you've run into? And anybody can answer that, but I just know you make it sound easy. What are the obstacles to this?
I can answer really quickly and just say, that we have been so impressed by the collaborators that we found. People like at the Bullock, like the amazing curators, and also collaborators in local county historical commissions in places like Hidalgo and Cameron County, who have asked for help in applying for historical markers. There have been challenges in applying for historical markers in some counties where there hasn't been local support. And so I'll just say that I have been inspired by the collaborations with descendants, who have been learning from them. Some of them have been creating websites to memorialize their loved ones long before Refusing to Forget started, or were applying for historical markers long before Refusing to Forget started. And so I'll say it's a mix, that there's challenges certainly, but I wanted to maybe start off an answer to that by talking about the momentum and people who are willing to have that conversation. I'll pass it to Sonia and John to answer the harder part.
Well, if I may, I mean, we've encountered, obstacles. Just going back to one of the things that Monica said about submitting numerous versions of applications. But I have to say that, especially listening to some of the descendants, my work didn't really involve interviewing any of the descendants directly, but I learned so much through Monica's work. And I just remember meeting one of the first meetings that we had with the Alvarado family from West Texas, and the years that they had just been waiting for, for the marker, for some kind of state recognition, that these sort of small roadblocks, just like, okay, we're not going to worry about those things. And just really, it was just so remarkable to see their patience, but their dedication and this drive to keep the story alive. And so, that made it, much more manageable. At least, I speak for myself, but also some of the local folks from at the county level, like Webb County, Jeanette Hatcher. Thank you, Jeanette. Maybe you're listening in, but who just made it made the process much more enjoyable, and just so eager eager to collaborate. And they were just so happy, just, like, wow, it's great that you guys are working on these issues. So that made it more manageable.
I'll just add and echo what Sonia and Monica have already said. I mean, I think it has been incredibly inspirational to work with the descendants, the families, because they've really been carrying this for over a century or more. We're latecomers to this for the most part, and so that's been incredibly inspirational. On the collaboration end, I'll also say that I think we had some incredible partnerships with UTRGV in our programming around the marker unveilings. UTRGV really, the folks there just really kind of stepped up to make it to host like a conference, a mini conference after the ceremonial unveiling, where there was a lot of kind of educational presentations, but also just a lot of community healing as well. And so I just want to give it a shout out to UTRGV, all the folks associated with that.
And
go ahead.
Just one other quick thank you to educator Juan Carmona, also from the Valley, and who has these incredibly talented high school students, and I think they're now like college students, but who actually participated, in so many of these events, but also in the Bullock conference in the spring of 2019. And they actually did a dramatization of the parts of the hearings. And it was just a very moving thing, because some of those words had not been publicly uttered for a centennial. So thank you to Mr. Carmona.
So you are doing all of this work, of course, at the same time that you are all professors. And so Monica mentioned having some students involved with the project, but this is just one piece of what you do. And so I know, Sonia, you have another book coming out, or maybe it just came out. Can you tell us about that? Oh, there you have it. Yeah, show it to us.
Yeah, this is my other little baby. I don't think my 10-year-old daughter is hearing. So, so thank you so much for this opportunity. And, this is a new book I published with the University of Illinois Press, For a Just and Better World, Engendering Anarchism in the Mexican Borderlands, 1900 to 1938. And the For a Just and Better World is a direct quote. Those words were uttered and penned by an anarcho-feminist by the name of Caritina Piña, who formed part of this anarcho-syndicalist organization anchored in the port of Tampico in the early 1920s, but with reach across the Mexican Republic, reach across Texas, with various groups from the Rio Grande Valley, and from further north in the country, and certainly across the Atlantic. And so I retrace the activism on the part of these women who in many ways use the memory of the Mexican Revolution to bring about change that not only included issues like worker autonomy and worker dignity, but also gender equity. And this is a very sort of a different group of women who are not necessarily interested in promoting, say, universal suffrage or fighting for increased political participation, because they're, for the most part, they're very attracted to the idea of anarchism and direct action, fighting on behalf of political prisoners. And so they began to develop a radical, what I call in the book, radical motherhood or revolutionary motherhood, that sort of echoed the state-sanctioned revolutionary motherhood. But in the case of these women, it was a motherhood that served the interests of mothers in the community, not the interests of the state and not the interests of any political party. So it's tied in to a certain extent to the work that I do with Refusing to Forget, because I'm very interested in the role that labor activists play in engaging the state directly. So even if these more sort of radical anarchist folks were not interested in forming part of the state, they were very critical about state violence, even critical when it came to so-called revolutionaries that were sort of allowing for only a certain type of labor activism or safe or state-sanctioned labor activism to take place. They were silencing radical voices like anarchists and communists. And the same thing was happening on this side of the border. So there's a section in the book where I talk about the role of the Rangers in promoting this idea of labor activists as bandits, as bandidos. The same thing is happening on the Mexican side of the border with the role of the Mexican rurales, just as notorious as the Texas Rangers. So this is very much sort of a larger border story, but that places women's experiences at the center of this narrative. So hopefully, I'll put the link in the chat and hope that people find it interesting. Thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so what's next for Refusing to Forget?
Well, I'll speak a bit to that, but of course, Sonia and Monica feel absolutely free to jump in. Really, I mean, one of the things that we've realized and that became, has become really obvious is that the work continues. And I think that there was perhaps a brief moment after the January 2019 conference where we kind of were easing off on the pedal, so to speak, on projects. But certainly last summer's, summer 2020's events surrounding the police murder of George Floyd, just reignited our commitment to furthering this project. And so I think that's going to take a number of forms. One, we're kind of pursuing funding for turning the Bullock exhibit into a traveling exhibit. One of the things that we want to make this exhibit accessible in a way, I mean, it was great getting started at the Bullock, but of course that was dependent upon folks having the means to get to Austin, right, during a relatively brief period of time. And we know that that's, accessibility issues are huge for many of our communities. So we'd like to take the exhibit to them. And so we're seeking funding for that. And of course, we would, in addition to the exhibit itself, we would, either in groups or individually, also seek to give talks associated with the exhibit wherever it may land. So that's one project. Other projects involve the question of the Texas Rangers, and in particular the bicentennial of the Texas Ranger founding is coming up in 2023. And, I think we are justifiably concerned that yet another round of myth-making about the Rangers is about to commence in earnest, right? And so we're very much committed to providing the correctives, right? The historical correctives and counter-narratives to what, is most likely to be an uncritical repetition of the myths of the past. So that certainly is on the horizon as well. Sonia, Monica, anything else?
Thank you, John. Well, to do all of this, Sarah and dear audience members, we need support. We need financial support. As John mentioned, we're seeking funding from various agencies, but save the date for November 29th at 6 p.m. for a fundraiser campaign that we will host virtually, and we'll talk about some of the projects that we've been working on and continue this important conversation and seeking your support. So we will send you that information, Sarah, so that you can help us promote it.
Wonderful. Yes, I think obviously that exhibit needs to travel throughout South Texas, but also come here to San Antonio. It's one of those things where this is not pretty history, but it's history that, again, I just feel like these are stories that are told in our families, and a way to get it affirmed, by this group of esteemed scholars to say, yes, the evidence is there, this really happened. Those aren't just family rumors. Really meaningful to people, right? To hear that and to know that history is being recognized. We do have a question from the audience that I wanted to share just before we wrap up. This is a question about psychological impact of these kinds of traumas and violence. And so he wants to know if you are aware of any psychological research looking at how this kind of abuse impacts communities, their worldview, etc.
I'll say that, that's certainly an area where more resources need to be put into studying the long-term impacts of climate, people living and navigating a climate of racial terror. Certainly in the cases of violence that I studied, descendants talked about the kinds of trauma that was passed from one generation to the next. Norma Longoria Rodriguez described it as inherited loss. She said it's an injustice that never leaves you. And so certainly it shaped how generations of people saw themselves in relationship to the state, in relationship to police, in relationship to voting. But there are also people who were victims of this violence, but suffered for years, and in some cases committed suicide because they were so haunted by what they had witnessed or had experienced themselves. And so there is more research that has looked at the long kinds of impacts on people's health, and how trauma is passed from generation to generation physically, but more work has been done in studying the impacts of lynching cultures, not just in how it shaped people's mental health and how they suffered with trauma, but also how it shaped institutions. And studying, for example, sociologists like Jeff Ward, for example, have studied how communities and counties with high rates of lynchings had high also then rates of things like corporal punishment in schooling. And so it is important to think not only about how these acts of violence like lynchings or police shootings committed fear and climates of terror, but how it also shaped institutions. And so you can also think about the long generational impact in policing, but also in something as mundane as schooling, and kinds of corporal punishment that were experienced by racial and ethnic minorities in the US.
Here's another audience question. This is from Dr. Sonia Aleman. She asks, given the current anti-CRT bills that have been passed, what are your thoughts about what educators can do to teach young people about these histories? And then she also wants to thank you for your work. John, Sonia, anybody?
It's kind of difficult to know if someone can jump in. Thank you so much, Professor Aleman, for that question. I mean, we've certainly discussed that in our RTF meetings. I think and some of this is more sort of just kind of things that just popped into my head right now, and some of this we've discussed, but I think we need to collaborate with educators. I think we need to help them out and find ways to, at least right now, to find ways to sort of how to this bill is sort of like a minefield, right? How to best navigate it and still find a way to teach some of this history. I mean, this is more of a censorship bill than anti-critical race theory. I mean, I don't know of any teacher who's teaching CRT, but the larger point that I want to make here is I think these collaborations are especially crucial. I think we need to, as educators in higher ed, I think it is our responsibility to help out those teachers in the K through 12 system. I've spoken to some of them in my area, in my neck of the woods here, and they are feeling the pressure. Just when some of them were just discovering, like, oh wow, there's Mexican American studies, curriculum material. Just when that was happening, and where we were making so much progress, then this happened, right? But so I think these collaborations are absolutely crucial.
I would just add that one, we absolutely have to acknowledge the kind of quandary that K through 12 educators are. In higher ed, we may have something called academic freedom as a kind of protection, but K through 12 folks don't. And on one hand, I think I think many young people are ready and if not eager to learn accurate history, right, about the place they live in. And on the other hand, bills like the ones that have recently passed, which are not disputing the accuracy of what's being taught, but rather the emotional states that may result from certain groups hearing about it, right? That is the kind of discomfort part. Well, I can only view those as incredibly ironic, given that for decades, children of color, Black, brown, indigenous, have been discomforted by the kind of racist history they had been taught for decades in Texas schools. So all of a sudden, when a certain group, is discomforted, it becomes an issue so important that the legislature has to step in to protect them. But then when it's been children of color, who are psychologically traumatized by what they've learned from racist history, well, nobody cared so much about that.
Yeah. Oh, it's tough for our K through 12 educators. So I agree. We need to find more ways to help and collaborate. One last question, because I know we're almost out of time, but do you foresee any possible future projects, research into some of the racial violence that occurred in the 1970s? The Hayes Morales case and the case of Santos Rodriguez are cited here, but of course there are others.
I can say that for mapping violence, I mean, the hope is to build a record from 1900 to 1930, but to extend it through the 20th century, and then to eventually work with other institutions and scholars to build a national record. I mean, right now we're trying to see what we find from these 3 decades, but certainly, Sonia and John could talk about this as well, that each time that we give public presentations, people bring forward cases that have happened more recently to say, this isn't something that just happened 100 years ago. Police brutality continued throughout the 20th century and people are still suffering. And so that's important to acknowledge. The other thing is the second thing that people always bring or ask about is how are we going to get this into the K through 12 classrooms? And that is something that is important to descendants as well. right? To say students need to learn from this, and also to echo Sonia's point that this is a real opportunity to collaborate. That academics, that historians, we have to be collaborating with educators to make sure that students have access to quality education, to truthful education, but also to an education that is inspiring, that helps them to explain what their history of their communities. And that's something that each time I teach about this history in university classrooms here now in Austin, but before in Providence, Rhode Island, there are students from Texas who say, I think my life would have been different if I knew about somebody like Jovita Idad when I was growing up in Laredo, as opposed to learning it as somebody who's now 21 years old. But also they shouldn't have to enroll in college courses to get access to that history. And so that's something that we do feel and are working towards to come back to John's point about our next phase of fundraising, to apply for grants so that we can make some of these collaborations come to fruition. And we recognize that we, again, need to be helping teachers by creating access to free resources, giving access to primary documents. The Gonzalez investigation, that 1,600 pages, that was a state congressional investigation. That's the kind of primary source that I think teachers can bring into the classroom, as people like Mr. Juan Carmona have done in such a powerful way. That how could you argue against teaching state documents? There's room to think creatively.
That's all great. That's wonderful. I know we're at the end of our hour, so I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure to hear about what the three of you are doing, as well as your other colleagues in Refusing to Forget. This video will stay here. So if you're watching on Facebook or if you're watching on YouTube, it will stay here. So if you didn't get to catch all of it, or if you want to share it with a friend, please do. These meetings will be here for future viewing. And, one of these days, we've been doing everything virtually during the pandemic. One of these days, hopefully we'll start doing some hybrid things where they will be, we got a question in the comments about technology. And you're right, there's a huge digital divide. So one of these days, we want to be able to start doing in a hybrid fashion so that we can reach people online, but also some in-person audiences. I want to just thank you again for joining us, panelists, as well as audience members, and thank our sponsors, the City of San Antonio, Bexar County. Tonight's talk was also sponsored by the University of Texas at Austin, and all of our donors. Thank you so much. Thank you again. Be well, and good night.